Ben. I'm a poli-sci and history double major, so I represent the liberal arts department of things. To be honest, most of this is more about like the content of my thesis, but I will try to tie it in as much as I can to sort of the process and how I, as a liberal arts student, went about that. So my thesis topic. My research covered the political positions and impacts of prominent Silicon Valley oligarchs Elon Musk, Thiel, and Marc Andreessen. That's Thiel right there. Hard work, I like that one quite a bit. The goal of my project was to understand the reactionary ideology of these figures and to the extent they and their views were influencing mainstream politics. After analyzing the perspective of these three figures and how they've affected America's political landscape, I aimed to extend my analysis to liberalism's relationship with reactionary politics and my conclusion. In other words, what does tech bro reaction tell us about liberalism? So a bit into why I chose this topic. There were several reasons I was interested in this topic. For one, my thesis covers contemporary politics, so that gives the subject material a sense of relevancy, importance, and unpredictability, as any day something new with these guys can give me something else to write about, especially Elon Musk. That was one of the most fun things about this project, in my opinion, was it's an endless treasure trove of content, and you never know what you're going to get. Every day you see a new article, and you don't know if it's reality or the Onion. It's something new. No. Elon Musk does the $1 million offer, and then I hear about Doge, Department of Government Efficiency. He did that after my defense, so now I have to go back and add all this stuff. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's an interesting experience. Additionally, an ongoing subject means there is generally less academic commentary on the topic, because it's not like there's been less time to talk about it. So that gives my thesis a chance to stand out with a little bit of novelty. I had limited knowledge of guys like Thiel, Andreessen, and even Musk. I wanted to learn more about these powerful men and how their power was shaping society. And knowing the historical precedent of elites often pushing back against democratic forces, I wanted to see how these guys would compare to past reactionaries. But before we get to that, first we need to define reaction. Reactionary is a term you hear a lot in politics, but I often don't think it's well defined. But for time's sake, I'm only going to go over 2 points, because in my thesis I lay out 5 criteria for what I think characterizes reaction. So firstly, reactionary politics is usually, but not strictly, far right, because it's aiming to uphold highly authoritarian forms of rulership in certain traditional hierarchies. These reactionary forces go further than defending the status quo. They want to intensify the power of those at the top. And that's really what I mean by authoritarian here. When we hear the word authoritarian, we typically think about like an all-powerful state that has intense power and abuses it. And that's true, but it goes beyond that. It can apply to other places too. So it's just talking about intense power concentration within the rulers of really any given hierarchy. So think of the Nazis and their totalitarian state as one, or the industrial age social Darwinists and their support for extreme capitalist domination. That is a form of authoritarianism, an economic form. Secondly, reactionary politics gains traction by pitting itself either against a fabricated or exaggerated scapegoat. It plays upon people's fears and insecurities and directs them toward a target by exaggerating the aims of the outgroup or the consequence of what will happen if they succeed. So here's a great political cartoon of that. So this was a anti-women's suffrage cartoon in the early 20th century. And it's basically the hens going out to public life and the male roosters left, and it's like, we talked about this in my Tennessee history class, and it's like, you're flipping the gender dynamics, society's literally going to fall apart, they think. So now let's go into the, a brief overview of the history of popular power, because that was a big section here, in my thesis, was, diving through some history and seeing what the precedent is. So notably, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan was a response to the liberal attack on monarchy in the 17th century England. Liberalism was sort of in its, fetal stage here, it's just beginning to develop. And arguably the first modern reactionary, I'd probably say he is, Hobbes uses liberal social contract theory to argue instead for an absolute king unimpeded by checks. So you see the authoritarianism there. It's not just he wants a king, he wants an all-powerful king. And notably the way he argues here is kind of ingenious, and this is sort of the hallmark of a good reactionary, a competent one, is that they take arguments from their opposition, flip them on their head, and mold them for their own purposes. When suffragists began to expand to propertyless white men in the Jacksonian era, reactionaries opposed it on the grounds that propertyless men would use the vote to expropriate property from the wealthy. This predates them even. You see this similar idea in the English Civil War. One of the Parliament factions was called the Levelers as an insult because it was believed that they were going to level society. It was basically communism before communism really existed as a word. The head of New York's constitutional delegation, James Kent, puts it pretty clearly. The tendency of universal suffrage is to jeopardize the rights of property and the principles of liberty. There is a constant tendency in human society, and in the history of every age proves it, goes on. There is a tendency in the poor to covet and to share the plunder of the rich, and the majority to tyrannize over the minority and to trample down their rights. They were very fearful of this type of thing. So that brings us to now. Who are these quote-unquote tech bros? So here's a brief description. Marc Andreessen, is probably the least well-known, co-founded Netscape in 1994, which was one of the first internet browsers. So that was pretty big. Later selling it for billions. Co-founded Andreessen Horowitz, which is a company that invests in smaller tech startups. He makes most of his money as a venture capitalist and invests in platforms such as Instagram. He's widely considered to be an intellectual in Silicon Valley, famously writing the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. Peter Thiel co-founded PayPal in 1998. He also co-founded Palantir, the security software company that works with agencies such as ICE and the CIA. He also wrote a manifesto called The Education of a Libertarian. And fun fact about him, he's been obsessed with the search for life extension technology. He's really wanting to, he has said in interviews before, like he really wants to achieve immortality. And Elon Musk doesn't really need an introduction, we all know him. He's the world's wealthiest man, a prominent American celebrity, and head of several major companies such as Tesla, SpaceX, and Twitter. So what do these guys think about democracy? One thing I like about Thiel is that he's not subtle at all. He's very direct. He states in his manifesto, "I no longer believe freedom and democracy are compatible." He also states additionally, since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. Elon Musk has posted multiple tweets with anti-democratic implications. For example, when met with the accusation that American government ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales so business interests like Musk could have better access to resources, he responded, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." And admittedly, Andreessen is the least politically authoritarian. He doesn't really come out against democracy at all. However, sorry to take a bit of a dark turn here, but Andreessen, Thiel, and Musk all have some connection to fascism in one way or another. In the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, Andreessen quotes and even names multiple fascists as patron saints of techno-optimism. Among them is the Italian futurist Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who would go on to co-write the 1919 Fascist Manifesto in Italy. Peter Thiel is friends with Curtis Yarvin, who's sort of a leading intellectual in this sort of dark enlightenment movement, as it's called. Among many things, Yarvin advocates for corporate fiefdoms throughout society, opposes democracy, has advocated even for the extermination of society's unproductive members. And fun fact, he's also friends with J.D. Vance, so there's something. And then Musk has made several anti-Semitic tweets. There's one, basically this guy saying that Jews are spreading anti-white propaganda, and then Musk says, "You're exactly right." So determining the influence of these guys. I think Marc Andreessen's influence is more like within the sphere of Silicon Valley predominantly, because he's sort of one of their intellectual types. Although he does offer more financial contributions, as you can see in his bubble there, the 25 million. Peter Thiel's become a recent titan behind the political stage. Most notably, Thiel was instrumental in financing Vance's career as a politician, and one of the main reasons Vance was nominated to be Trump's VP. He's also donated heavily. Musk has got a lot going on. He's over $70 million for his super PAC. Is something notable, which of course is his celebrity personality. Musk can easily export these reactionary ideas of tech oligarchs, especially with his ownership of X. I'm going to briefly go over here. We'd be missing the larger picture if we don't tie it back into liberalism. Are these guys just an extension of larger anti-democratic tendencies and power imbalances within the liberal order? To some degree they are, We can criticize Musk's attitude, but he didn't invent coup d'etat, nor is he the first to, indicate this problem of media oligopolies, other people like own vast amounts of, billionaires own vast amounts of media as well. However, these guys do signify an ominous march toward economic authoritarianism. Andreessen talks about it in his manifesto. Peter Thiel wants to escape from politics, as he puts it. And then Musk used Twitter, and this ties into another point of economic authoritarianism is interwoven with political authoritarianism. And Musk uses Twitter to aid foreign government censorship, such as with India in 2022, proves it is already happening. And while I argue that the rise of anti-democratic reaction is inevitable, as groups of elites feel threatened by popular power, as we've seen historically and today, the response to it isn't. You're probably wondering why I have a MTSU workers bi-weekly pay up there. Doesn't sound like it has anything to do with it, but I think it absolutely does. Because while these guys can, buy your representatives and even shape who's even on the ballot in the first place, their options, the one thing they cannot control is your own voice. So, there's something. And now, so tying this in to takeaways from the thesis process. First and foremost, pick something you're interested in and find a professor you have a good relationship with and is knowledgeable on the topic. That sort of does narrow your choices because they have to be competent in that, aware of that field and who you like. So there's several conditions there, but that's important. I think it's okay to struggle with motivation. This is something I had. Getting yourself to begin working on the research project, I think, is the hardest part. But once you really get into it, you begin to get hooked with it and you become passionate about the work and it becomes easier. Because a thesis project can be just about anything, each person has a unique experience in the thesis process. So like for me, it was mostly just research and writing. It was pretty much those two things, the two halves of the whole. That simple. I research, what these guys are saying, I research the history, and then I just commentate on it and extrapolate on it. So here's some tips and advice. Pacing yourself is really important. You're given basically complete independence of the project. You're your own guide for completing it in a timely fashion. So don't procrastinate and meet frequently with your thesis advisor, weekly to bi-weekly. I think sometimes it's okay to have little gaps if you really know what you're doing, but generally you want to be on the ball with that. One thing that I experienced, since talk about doing research, be prepared to jump through some hoops at finding sources. There are great resources out there. So the Walker Library has the Dual Search, and then there's JSTOR. And don't be afraid to reach out to your professors for resources. My thesis advisor was so helpful in providing me articles and pointing me where to go. So please talk to them, they'll help with that. But not everything is available online. In fact, I ended up getting a copy of Leviathan that was 110 years old in the library that has torn pages out of it, which is surprising because Leviathan's a pretty well-established political classic work. And for the thesis defense, you will succeed in it so long as you're prepared to know the material. Honestly, I thought it could even be a fun opportunity to just yap about the project you've worked so hard on. So, any questions? Yes?
I definitely have a question. So, how does Thiel explain that freedom and democracy are incompatible?
Oh, yes. So when he's talking about freedom, he makes it pretty clear he's talking about the freedom of the capitalist, in that he thinks that the people are sort of infringing upon the capitalist economy to do what they want.
Lord have mercy.
Yeah, no, that's what he believes. That's why I brought up seasteading. Are you familiar with that? Basically, it's the idea of building artificial islands out in the middle of the ocean that would be like little libertarian capitalist utopias, so that there wouldn't be any regulation or whatever. That's why he uses the term escape from politics. I'm not joking, that's his exact phrasing. And one of the things I grapple with is what the hell does that even mean? Escape from politics? And then I'm like, oh, he means escape from politics that, infringe upon the interests of capital. It's just, his wording there is very interesting. Yes?
I don't know if this goes a little bit beyond the research you did do, but on these three people, do you know if these kinds of political opinions are ones that they were expressing or repeatedly expressing before they got to the economic status that they achieve now? Or is this something that they started being either more vocal or expressing after they had already accumulated this level of wealth?
That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure, but I do know for Peter Thiel, I think it had always been sort of like avid libertarian and talked about like his time in Stanford, which is ironic because Palantir, which is literally named after the orb that like Sauron uses in Lord of the Rings, by the way, the all-seeing eye, which is just so ironic to me. He gives his own explanation, but I mean, named after that has helped the CIA and helped ICE to like, you know, increase like security in spy software. So for him though, he's had ideological leanings. Musk wasn't even political that long until like recently. So for him, I think this is relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, he was involved in politics, but it was a lot more neutral and it wasn't like nearly as expressive with it. And Andreessen, I really don't know about. So that's what I have to say.
I want to counter your point when you say, you showed the MTSU labor group workers on the right side of your screen. You said these wealthy people can't control your voice, your vote, but they can sure as heck influence it because
Right.
they essentially control the media, which controls they've got mind control, marionette strings over your thinking. Be careful.
Yeah, I mean, no, there's definitely truth to that. And that's what I bring up with Musk is like, and that's something I mentioned too. Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan talks about how the king should be able to define truth itself. And what I was saying in sort of my analogy is like, in a way the capitalist has done like what Hobbes like wish he could have done because of their control on media perception. It's very Orwellian in a way, but it's not coming from the state as much, although they do have a hand, as I mentioned. So, yes.
Since a lot of your stuff has to do with right now and Elon Musk is like mostly on Twitter showing his politics and things like that, was it hard for you to find like peer-reviewed sources to cite and things?
So most of my sources were just like journal articles and then like a few books, so I didn't really do as much of that because that's not really, I mean, it's really, a lot of it's just like pulling straightly from what these guys say, or just like, hey, this is an event that happened. It wasn't like necessarily like deep digging into the type where you would do peer review, although in my revisions I am thinking that I might go back and add a few. So that's my answer to that. But books and articles are really good.
Thank you, sir.